as the chief curator of Soweto Museums, which includes the Hector Peterson Memorial and Museum and the Kliptown Open Air Museum. But now he's with the Vets History Workshop. And then also we are joined by Mr. Eric Itzkin, who is in charge of immovable heritage in the city of Johannesburg under the umbrella of the Arts, Culture and Heritage Directorate. And then we have Molemo Moilwa, whom I've worked with, on many occasions, but she has been previously the director of VANSA and which is the collective that she started with Nare Mohoto, and the exhibition or project that they did, which was called Territorios. And then finally, we have Sumaya Valley, who is with the architectural firm Counterspace, and they have like wide-ranging projects which are centered much more around community and not just bricks and mortar. So thank you all very much for joining us. Again, I would like to thank VANSA for hosting us, and also Tukuluho, who is the host of this webinar, and all of the technical work that she has done, and for being very patient with some of us old people who don't know this technology very well. So with that said, let me quickly just give you some kind of context as to why I wanted to have this discussion. So as some of you will recall, in the early days of the lockdown, there were some concerns around the effectiveness of measures such as social distancing in relation to places which are crowded, like informal settlements, and how people would be able to observe frequent hand washing if there isn't proper sanitation or running water in those settlements. And my thinking was that, oh, well, of course, these are legitimate questions that people are asking. But there were two questions that occurred to me. One is, well, shouldn't the question not be whether or not people should observe these things, but rather should we be asking instead that those the conditions should be improved. So we have to start thinking about how do we actually make sure that we no longer live in a country where we have these kinds of conditions to begin with. The second question that arose out of that is, there seems to be the implication that informal settlements were inherently ridden with disease and unhygienic and all of those kinds of associations. Whereas actually, in fact, we know that, for quite a greater part of the lockdown and for in the early days of the pandemic, the people who were the carriers of COVID-19 were actually international travelers and people who were actually in a much more privileged space. So the kind of concerns about, the fact that informal settlements might be the places where the outbreak might happen seem to me to play into the kind of irrational fear about certain people in certain spaces. So but then also, of course, I also started thinking about how there was in what we now call Newtown in Johannesburg, there was a vast settlement that was razed to the ground in 1904 because of the outbreak of plague in Johannesburg and surrounding areas. And that outbreak was used as a pretext by the Johannesburg municipality at the time to forcibly remove the people who lived there and to, as I said, to burn the whole thing to the ground. And it is then the people who were moved from there were moved to a place which was called Klipspruit, and maybe Put Ali will try to sort of map out for us briefly where Klipspruit is in kind of today's geography and terminology. So there is a kind of a clear correlation, in my view, not just in my view actually, between spatial segregation and concerns over public health and safety and concerns over health and pandemics, and how these various forms of discrimination find expression through the fear of contamination and or infection, and the spread of disease. So I would like also, which is also why we have architects now in this conversation, to help us, understand. About what are the implications, possible implications, in contemporary South Africa now, of these kinds of fears and how they find expression in public discourse, in the way that we do our planning and public policy, etc., etc. So it's quite a lot to chew on, but I'm just wanting to see how we think around certain issues. I mean, for instance, there is this term which I believe was coined by somebody called Maynard Swenson, called sanitation syndrome, which is this kind of term that seeks to express this combination of fears, which has to do with spread of disease, public health, criminality, and how these fears are used as vehicles for various forms of discrimination, but in particular racial and spatial segregation. Okay, so I would like to just start by asking Eric Itzkin the following question. Johannesburg is a quintessential migrant city. Employment has always been seen as the main driver for patterns of settlement, but some of the research which you shared with us during the preparation for this webinar suggests that there are other drivers of settlement patterns, including the concerns over sanitation. So can you elaborate a little bit on this, Eric? Do we have Eric? Eric, I think you may have to unmute your...
Yes, I think I'm audible. Yes. Thank you very much.
Okay, yes, you are.
Okay, so sanitation was indeed a major concern in early Johannesburg. I mean, consider the fact that there was no waterborne sewerage system across much of the town, including in the white, more privileged areas, for the early decades of the 20th century. And people were reliant on sanitary workers from the municipality actually removing the night soil. And I think a measure of maybe the precariousness of the system came with the strike of the sanitary workers in 1918, where you had services being disrupted across Johannesburg. Schools, clinics, private homes were not serviced. And the force of the reaction from the authorities in cracking down on the strike, I think, gives you some measure of the kind of threat that this posed, you know.
Yeah.
Striking workers were rounded up and forced actually to work at gunpoint. So,
Wow.
yeah, that's the one piece of history that I wanted to throw in. The other one, Kwesi, is what you referred to earlier, that forced removal, or actually not so forced, but an engineered removal, let's say, from what the authorities called the insanitary area of, well, what we know as Newtown. So, you know, that space is where lots of poor people congregated and settled. There were people of different races and colors, and it was an area of concern on many levels for the authorities. They were concerned to prevent this kind of racial intermingling, which they regarded as a threat to the established order. And conditions which were quite dire and represented maybe that kind of feared image of the squatter camp. It was very close to what you had there, you know. Terrible overcrowding, a lack of services, and you know, extreme neglect on the part of the authorities who actually created this situation. So I think also we have to think about the state of medical knowledge and popular conceptions as well at the time. Plague did in fact break out, bubonic plague, and it seems to have given rise also to pneumatic plague, which spreads by coughing and sneezing and much like COVID-19. But the bubonic version is spread by rats, well, fleas on rats, in fact. And that's what took off in an area called Kuli location, a small, congested, overcrowded space located more or less where the mills are presently in Newtown. So many medical experts at the time and for lots of ordinary people, there was a lot of misconception really about the causes of plague. And there was a widespread belief that it was to do with infected soil, that it actually was a kind of a miasma with disease actually impregnated in the soil. And that's part of what the authorities acted on, but not the full story. If you go back a little earlier in the history, for some years already, the authorities had been wanting to clear this area of people. For some of the reasons that we've mentioned, because it could breed disease, because of the breakdown of segregation, if you want, that went on there, but also because of the economic value of this land. The railways had come in towards the end of the previous century, and that opened up a lot of potential and raised the value of the land if only it could be cleared. So there were various kind of schemes mooted to remove the population, and it found fruition actually when the plague hit, and people could be moved on the, let's say, the pretext of ensuring public health. So in that sense, it wasn't forced. It kind of fit in with a lot of, public conceptions and misconceptions about the disease. So as was just mentioned, the population was removed. Actually, firstly, the area was burnt to the ground, and it burnt for 2 or 3 days. The authorities actually put in corrugated iron going right down into the ground to a depth I've read of 18 inches to try and prevent in that way this disease, from spreading. This mixed population, which included Africans, Indian people, and Malays, were transported to a far-flung and remote place, best known for a sewage works, Klipspruit or Pimville, housed in very rudimentary, strained conditions, close to the sewage works, and in circumstances that did anything but fight, any sort of public health menace. So they were in fact placed at risk there with terrible rates of disease and child mortality and so on. So I think what we can get out of this is that, in a racially divided, highly unequal society like ours was and continues to be, threats of disease and infection are filtered and mediated through power structures that are inherently unequal, and it's a powerful example of measures taken in the name of public health, which are injurious, I guess medically, but certainly socially. We can talk further about how that set in motion a long-running pattern, which is imprinted on the landscape now of expelling poor Black people, often under the banner of slum clearance.
Okay, Sumaya, as I've alluded to earlier, around the early days of the lockdown, there were these concerns about informal settlements and the possibility, or even the fear, that those would be the epicenters of outbreaks, precisely because of the lack of sanitation and the proper facilities. So what I'm interested in, or what I'm curious about, is do you think that these fears were legitimate, or they simply play into the kinds of irrational fears that are associated with Black bodies and with people that don't look like us? And yeah.
Thank you, Kwesi, for the question. I think, as you alluded to earlier when you described that, we should be asking deeper questions of these issues. I think that it is both. I think, and this is without looking through all the sets of data that we may have available, but also we know that looking at that is flawed because of how data is collected sometimes and so on. I think that something that we've all felt when lockdown started is that this is exacerbating inequalities that we already have in really, really big ways. Arundhati Roy wrote an article that's quite famous a few weeks ago, where she said that the tragedy is immediate, epic, and real, but it's not new. It's the wreckage of, what did she say, a train that's been careening down a track for years. And I think that it is very indicative of a much larger, much larger systemic problems of segregation that we have in our cities. And I think there are so many layers of questions that we have to ask. The one, of course, is about all the spheres of isolation that we have because of apartheid city planning and because of our class and race divides. But the other is also just for our immediate present, why our lockdown measures mirror so much those of European cities or of cities that we can't relate to. And I think that something as an architect that I felt quite strongly when this started is that, in the suburbs, we have like a quarantine light. People have double garages. Everyone can isolate comfortably in their own room, perhaps with their own bathroom, some even with swimming pools, tennis courts, dare I say. In informal settlements, there are so many people who live so closely together who have to perhaps go outside for water, who maybe don't have a fridge at home, so are forced to go and get groceries very often. And that these perhaps our models of isolation should also be tailored to what our cities actually are, instead of us just inheriting something and then blankly playing that out. And I think in the ways that the lockdown has played out, I mean, when it started, I saw some horrifying clips from how do I say, Western media channels, very popular Western news channels that showed, it was really, really horrible, and I think perpetuates what you're describing about Black bodies, where it showed, an inability for people to be able to isolate, queues of people outside supermarkets and so on, that I think were really very violent and offensive news media reportings. But I think there are also lots of really small stories of resistance that I've read and heard of in informal settlements. Women coming together and seamstresses stitching masks for the elderly, people sharing sanitizers, teenagers acting as monitors for social distancing and so on, and without romanticizing that at all. I think that there are also things we can learn from in our own conditions, in how resilient and agile people are. So I'm not really answering anything, but I'm saying that it's very complex, and I think that for me, the main challenge has been that our system of lockdown should be a lot more nuanced and a lot more tailored to our conditions.
I mean, okay. I mean, I'm not. I'm just adding to what you are saying, and because of course, Johannesburg Art Gallery is situated in the major transport hub. So, just moving from where I live to where. To the gallery, during the early days of lockdown, I was like quite shocked to see how many people were out and about in this area. But then I remembered, but this is where all of the essential services, people who are considered essential services, they have to get around somehow. So this is where they would come so just our, even the way that we picture what isolation, self-isolation or quarantine might look like is very much informed by, among other things, our class perspective and around the areas in which we live. But Ali, I just wanted to talk to you. Like, I'm just wanting to shift the conversation a little bit. Um, you know, uh, without wanting to quote the U.S. Issues too much, but I mean, I read something along the lines that the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic in the U.S. has claimed more lives than the Vietnam War and the Iraq War put together, American lives, that is. Um, and we have the Vietnam War Memorial and those kinds of things, and that just got me to thinking about how in South Africa, for instance, and I'll talk a little bit about HIV a bit later on, but we have so many memorials and so many museums that commemorate the anti-apartheid struggle. And, of course, you and I have been chief curator at the Hector Peterson Memorial and Museum. But it got me to thinking about how do we reflect on the lives, for instance, that have been lost through, various other tragedies, including the HIV/AIDS pandemic, but also got me to thinking about other kind of historical sites, why it is that they seem not to have been marked or seem to have been erased. The whole Brickfield settlement, or the so-called Queen location, which is now was in present day Newtown. If you're walking around that area, there's virtually no kind of sign or even allusion to the fact that there were lives there that existed there. There was no kind of even just a plaque or a street name or anything of that nature to signal that that this event happened. So I'm just wanting to maybe get your reflection about, and it's not just about Johannesburg. It's throughout the country. Maybe with the exception of District 6, there are very few places where these kinds of major social upheavals that happened are properly commemorated, especially the people whom we have lost through pandemics.
Thanks. Thank you, Kwesi. I mean, there's just a few points I would like to make with regards to the question you are raising. First, it is an important observation that you are making. Part of the reason really is that pandemic and experiences of ordinary people do not form part of this want to utilize to buttress their standing in society, but also to deepen the new imagination they want to create about the society they are trying to establish. That concept of an imagined nation. So an imagined nation has to be created on triumphalism. It has to be created in the name of heroes, which is why there is a lot of focus on 20th century liberation struggles. I mean, if you take, for example, Robben Island itself, the story of political prisoners then gets high attention, but that it was once a place for people who had leprosy has disappeared completely from the narrative of Robben Island. In the same way, as you mentioned, what Eric spoke about around how people were moved from Newtown. I mean, there has been attempts within Newtown to create some kind of trail with text panels, but it has not appealed to the popular imagination as the sites of liberation struggles have. Part of the reason, of course, is that the elite that drives the making of heritage sculptures, public sculptures in particular, and monuments, prefer to underplay class distinctions. And in this conversation, and it is the upper classes, if one were to use that word, in the heritage landscape. I also think part of the other two, one of the other reason is the role of tourism in shaping the heritage landscape or public histories. And tourism drives the idea of generating income, creating jobs, and the stories of poor people are probably not seen as a vehicle to attract foreign tourists who will then make a spend, with the exception of places like your Soweto, where to a large extent that history has itself become reflect the deeper contradictions of the two colleagues have indicated how the spatial divide continues to be with us to this day, and how, of course, this current pandemic has reminded us of something we shouldn't have forgotten about the realities of inequality. And of course, when the Minister of Arts and Culture was talking about funding artists for COVID-19.
I think we are losing.
Of course, he mentioned that he hopes that they will say something about COVID-19 pandemic. But as I was listening to him, I knew that
I think we have lost you, Put Ali. So okay, so
what he
these are
needs is
okay. I think I will have to ask Put Ali to move a little bit from where you are, because we are having reception problems. The joys of virtual communication. But maybe while we are trying to resolve that issue there, we did get a lot of what you had expressed, but I think maybe in the interest of just moving the conversation along, I'll maybe ask you to maybe finish the points that you were making a bit later on when you've got better reception. Okay, so Mulemo, the work that you did with Nari around territorios spoke a lot about land reclamation and but also resilience amongst the communities that were trying to grapple with issues of land use and ownership. So I'm just curious about what this crisis might mean in terms of, how we exercise our sense of placement or where we live, how do communities find these. I mean, Sumaya did touch on it a little bit on this idea of resilience, and as as ways of responding to crises. Yeah, we can talk about the South African context, but also maybe also just talk more generally about the different contexts in which you researched as made you look.
Sure, thanks, Kwesi. So the ISO series, which was a year-long series of exhibitions, was really premised on the idea of thinking about we assume that the land will come back. It's just a question of when and how. But when the land comes back, what does that mean, and what are the choices that we can make about that? And it was really trying to move away from this idea of the land being returned simply on the basis of sort of small plots of private property for individual families, and that's it. But rather trying to think through others in the majority world who have also had experiences of dispossession of land, and to think about ways in which others have thought about the return of land. And in particular, thinking about the way tenure enables, and this was actually a term that Dineo Skosana, who's a academic who's looked a lot at forced grave removals, for example, she uses the term psychological safety and spiritual safety, and that tenure enables a certain kind of spiritual safety. And that safety or security emerges out of all the things that come with tenure and land access. But that's not simply about property per se, but also about these kinds of multiple things that come with the kinds of communities and emergent strategies for resilience that become possible with tenure. So a lot of the examples we were looking at in Latin America and Asia, other parts of the African continent, was very much about the kinds of linkages between peoples that become really important when we think about the return of the land, which speaks to many of the things Simea was talking about, which is about sort of the ways in which people develop connections and communities between them in conjunction with tenure, which is also about trying to think about land not simply within the frameworks of ownership of property, but also in the ways that it relates to our spiritual lives, our health, our kind of communities and relationships as well. And there were a number of really interesting examples, for example, from Mexico, of ways in which autonomous communities look to develop their own healthcare systems, their own education systems, and their own ways of governing land rights and land relationships. That we found really interesting to think about in terms of land restitution, not simply being this property issue, but being a broader political question of who we want to be and what it really means to, say, decolonize how we relate to the land and how we relate to each other.
You know, just to piggyback on what you were saying, I mean, I was just thinking about this as you were talking about how, for instance, we have this genre of music which probably young people don't know about, or maybe even people of my own generation don't know about, which is called Marabi, which of course is came out of a place called Marabastad, which is a place that no longer exists now, and how, even culturally, certain forms of culture emerge from certain spaces, but when those places disappear or are erased, not just in a physical sense, but in the sense of cultural memory, we also lose. It's almost like we're losing a part of our culture, of our identity, and our way of life. Anyway, so I want to just maybe switch things around a little bit and start and go back to Sumaya, and so I just want to refer you to an incident which happened, I think, in 2018 or 2019, where there was a big hoo-ha about then executive mayor of Johannesburg, Herman Mashaba, expressed shock and outrage that people were pushing, were carrying around cows' heads on a shopping trolley in the middle of the street, which was actually strange for me because I've been working in Joburg Park. That's sort of like a daily occurrence, and it's not, there's nothing shocking or amazing about it. But it did spark this whole kind of issue around sanitation and people using sanitary practices and, in meat preparation or in food preparation and all of this kind of stuff. And it just made me think about how, hundreds of, tens of thousands of people pass through this area every day. And, they, many people eat in places or, that are maybe some other people would consider unsanitary. I don't know. But there seems to be quite a large disconnect between what, at least, his thinking was in terms of what would be appropriate and what the reality was. So I'm really quite concerned about this apparent disconnect between public policy and the reality on the ground around issues such as public health and safety.
Yeah, I think I remember the incident very well also. I remember Mashaba's statement, and I also remember thinking about it as well. I think that I just want to echo what you're saying. I feel like, and also what I was talking about just now, there's a complete disjuncture between what is going on in the city and how policy is played out, or the imaginary of what the city should be. And I think, I mean, even as an architecture student, a lot of what, or when I was a student at least, I found that a lot of what we learned was, and this is a very deeply systemic thing. We often learn things that are from elsewhere, and the way that we learn about cities is from other models entirely. And what that perpetuates sometimes is that when we are out of school, we are only able to see and recognize what we saw in books as the city, which cancels out 90% of the city, and which also perpetuates the idea that we should not be engaging with those conditions deeply. And I think that, again, as I was saying earlier, there is, and this is not a general statement, but in my own personal experience from some of the research work I've done, there are so many agile systems around how people transport water and things like storage and infrastructures that are able to pop up and collapse in really agile and resilient ways, and how those are able to move and travel, but also operate against all odds. And I think that we can learn so much from those, again, without romanticizing the difficulty in putting together those infrastructures. We need to be able to actually engage with our city a lot more. And I think even at the level of policy, there is so much about what we see elsewhere and what we think our city needs. And often, I mean, sometimes I've been in meetings where policymakers talk about something they saw in Amsterdam, or imagine what this would be like in Joburg. I'm not saying we can't claim all of those things for ourselves as well. Of course we can, but I think that we need a much deeper engagement with the actual realities of our city.
Okay, so let me. Okay, so sorry, I interrupted you there. Can you finish your thought?
No, that was it. Thank you.
Okay, all right. So I'm, okay. Let me just say that I'm one of those people who are guilty of of doing false comparisons. But so my follow-up question to you is, so on the one hand, all right, okay, okay, I'm not being articulate at the moment, but it's just so many things running through my mind. Okay, but one of the things, for instance, being a head of a museum that one tends to do is that you go to museums in other countries and you see how things are done there, and then you're like, oh my goodness, I wish my own space did certain things in a certain way, and so there is this kind of issue or around, okay, if we are not going to just simply mimic what is going on in other spaces, assuming, of course, that the resources are there, like, but what would that thing look like? Um, uh, in the most ideal, under the most ideal conditions. And then the second question would be, okay, if we cannot attain those ideal conditions, what would the thing look like? Uh, 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 Given the current circumstances, whether it's resources or whether it's the issue of, cultural proclivities or whatever it might be, So it almost seems to me that we need to have two sets of imaginations. The one imagination is the ideal one, and the other one is, okay, if not this, then what?
I think maybe we have to operate at different speeds, which is something that I talk about often when I talk about my attempt at practice. The one is about engaging with the now very boldly and proposing and testing things and learning from everywhere that we can, from all sources. But the other one, I think, and this points to what I was talking about a deeper systemic issue, is about seeding and understanding that we need, it's almost like a generational project. We need new knowledges and new imaginaries around what our own systems and societies can look like. And I think that we have to be able to operate at both those speeds at once all the time. The one is, and the one reflects on the other one, I guess, as well.
All right. I'm sorry, maybe I'm jumping around quite a bit, but let me go again to Eric, and so just to keep the flow going a little bit. So the dream of an inclusive and integrated city remains elusive. To what extent do you think the current health crisis might assist us, to reorganize our thinking, or perhaps also in the opposite direction, to actually even more deeply entrench current spatial patterns and proclivities? Eric, are you there?
Hi, Kwezi. I got your question. You can hear me. Okay.
Yes, I can hear you.
So I think maybe to start with setting out the situation as we have it. I think a big part of it is what was discussed about the dispersal of particularly poor Black communities to the margins, necessitating long commutes to places of work and public amenities and so on. Another very strong feature is the degree of urban sprawl. You know, that the city is spread out over quite a vast area with dispersed settlements. And I mean, in the post-apartheid period up to now, planners in Joburg and elsewhere have looked at the need for more compact settlements for reasons of efficiency, to deliver services, but also it's been that notion has been advanced as a way of bringing more democratic, equitable kind of spatial dispensation. In Johannesburg, there have been projects launched under the mantle of the Corridors of Freedom to try to promote integrated communities closer to business centers, on transport links, and you know, it's worth watching whether such initiatives are going to be sustained. So I think we're all struggling to imagine, you know, a post-COVID situation, but the general expectation, I think, is a gradual return to normal activity, and normal activity being, you know, structured along the lines of existing spatial inequalities as well. At the same time, we're going to be looking, I think, for some time to come at a weakened economy, you know, on all different levels, personal, you know, metro level and so on. And some of the expected impacts would include reduced incomes, greater poverty, job losses, and so on. And I think we will see impacts from that, from the weakened economy in terms of new construction and in terms of a number of public works, you know, and municipal, you know, interventions and projects included. So I think the picture is looking quite worrying in terms of people having lost incomes, having fewer means, less opportunity perhaps to move, to change their situation. Maybe a fall off in new housing developments and you know, the kind of opportunities that those can bring. So I think the fear would be a further perpetuation of the current imbalances. And I hope that's not the full picture, and that there are other mitigating issues and factors that people can bring to light.
Sure. Okay. It looks like we are almost towards the end of the hour. Time has gone by very quickly, so I just throw one last question maybe to Molemo, and then you can also after that just give me, each one of you just give me concluding remarks if you so wish. But Molemo, I just wanted you to reflect a little bit on, for instance, how we've talked about spatial segregation. We've talked a little bit about resilience but I also and class differences. But I also wanted to talk a little bit as well about how the fear of disease and has been also vectors for other social forms of social what is prejudice. And I'm speculating here, of course, but I think that, for instance, the part of the reason why sex work is still criminalized is precisely because of this fear of sex workers as people who are somehow quote unquote unworthy, or the idea that certain notions of uh, uh, certain notions of hygiene and all of these things seem to stick on to certain bodies. I remember also, of course, in the 80s and 90s, the kind of association of HIV with the gay community, those kinds of fears. I mean, recently also, again in the US, there were incidents where Chinese Americans were attacked because of COVID-19. So I'm just wanting you to reflect a little bit about how these types of pandemics or fear of disease and infection become a factor in other forms of social discrimination.
Thanks, Kwesi. You had mentioned earlier some examples of drama in the media or like in social media around people sort of teaching their domestic workers how to clean, for example, or how to wash their hands, for example.
Yes.
And I in fact have, I lead an adult education program, have done for a number of years. And just before the closure of our program due to the shutdown, we had a session on coronavirus. And one of the members of the group was really pissed off because her madam wouldn't let her leave the house. And actually the main reason she was pissed off was not because she couldn't leave the house, but because her madam and her boss were still going to gym. And in her kind of critique of the situation, and I'm now in translation and kind of in a short version, she said something along the lines of, who is the child in the situation? And I think what she said was a really interesting poignant critique around a certain kind of paternalism that is definitely race-based, that has played out very much in those kinds of Zelda Lagrange domestic worker kind of cleanliness issues. This idea that the person who keeps your house clean now needs to be taught by you to keep themselves clean. It's just like this really wildly paternalistic idea. And I think maybe just as my own closing point, I think we see this paternalism play out in the state as well. And the nature of our lockdown and the nature of the violence of our lockdown and who was locked down strongly speaks to a kind of paternalism that is that certainly comes from apartheid, and that our state too easily copies in the space of the state of emergency. And I think there needs to be a much broader conversation around what it means to be treated like children in this kind of replication of a sort of race mentality.
Sure. Sumaya, closing remarks?
I think also some of the things that we went through in the prep just made me really think about us thinking about our deep past and deep future also. We talked a little bit about land and about where people live, and apartheid and spatial planning meant that that Black people lived next to mine dumps, for example, next to sewage plants in Cape Town, and that white people live next to zoos, parks, and trees. And I think that if we understand the generational impact of that, it means that certain groups of our population might have weaker lungs than others. And what does that mean at a time like this as well? Of course, you know, I think this is all over the world. In the UK as well, there have been studies recently about Black and BAME communities and the weakness of their lungs in response to the virus. But I think in South Africa, we have such extreme examples of this. And apartheid was so designed down to the architecture that we ingest and the violence of breathing as well, something that we need to reflect on.
Sure. Put any closing remarks, if Eddie? You need to unmute yourself, Put Ali.
Yes, I have done so. Yeah, but the last point I just want to make as a concluding remark, I mean, is just to express fears that are similar also to those expressed by Eric. I think the invoking of the idea of the war, that there is a war that is being fought, which is the coronavirus, may just in itself be a lost opportunity to reflect better on what the challenge is and what then should be solutions to it. Because once it was militarized, bringing in soldiers, bringing in the police, particularly in those areas where African people live, is probably just an indication that there is going to be a challenge in reimagining a better South Africa post COVID-19. And when the politicians and the ruling elite speak, you know, one does not get a sense that they are, or they have ideas about how to grapple with the stubborn geography of apartheid. Even when they spoke about temporarily moving people from so-called densely populated areas so that there could be social distancing, there were not humane alternatives that they were putting on the table. Yeah, thanks, Chris.
Okay, no, thanks for that. Closing remarks, put Eric.
Thanks, hi. Okay. Just I wanted to say that I think this discussion was a very valuable opportunity for us to delve into things that are, you know, underrepresented in public culture, in formal spaces. We've spoken about gaps in terms of museum representations, heritage products, and so on, which I think Ali rightly said is due in large measure to power structures and issues of funding and prejudice as well. But I think it's valuable for us to be able to keep on talking about these issues and to think also about possibilities for taking them into a whole range of other media, you know, online, but also it can be drama, it can be literature, it could be a whole range of things, and not necessarily, you know, the monumental statue.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Eric. And thank you, Putali. Thank you, Sumaya. Thank you, Mulemo. And thank you to Kuluho and the Refugio from Vansa. This has been a wonderful conversation. I wish we had had more time. There was still a lot more that I wanted to ask of you. But much gratitude to everyone. Thank you so much for participating and for your interesting perspectives. And also thank you to everybody that joined us, the quote-unquote audience. Hopefully we will be able to take these conversations forward, not just on these online platforms, but elsewhere as well. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Signing off. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.